An FBI agent drew a gun on a royal guard on sovereign soil with his badge in one hand and a sidearm in the other. He said, "This isn't your jurisdiction." But neither was the weapon he held on a British soldier. What happened next? 3 minutes later, armed palace units surrounded the embassy. And the agent realized he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career. Want to know exactly how it unfolded? First, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. That October morning had the kind of crisp bite that makes you pull your coat tighter and wish you'd remembered proper gloves. Frost clung to the iron railings outside St. James's Palace, and every breath came out in little white puffs that disappeared almost immediately. The ancient stonework looked scrubbed clean by the wind, and even the pigeons seemed to move with more purpose in the sharp air. Tourists clustered behind the rope barriers, phones already out even though nothing official was scheduled for another hour. But that's the thing about these places, you don't need an event to feel like you're standing in front of something important. School groups huddled together in matching scarves. An elderly German couple shared coffee from a thermos that steamed in the cold air. A father lifted his young daughter onto his shoulders for a better view over the heads of other visitors. Standing motionless beneath the central archway was Lance Corporal Tristan Hale. If you'd walked past without knowing better, you might have thought he was carved from stone. 28 years old, built like he could carry a wounded man for miles. He wore the full ceremonial kit that tourists come from around the world to see. His scarlet tunic was pressed sharp enough to draw blood, every gold button gleaming like miniature suns against the red wool. The white belt around his waist was pristine as fresh snow, his black boots polished to mirror perfection, reflecting the gray London sky. His bearskin hat sat at exactly the regulation angle, not a single hair out of place, while his left hand rested with mathematical precision on the hilt of his ceremonial saber. Beneath him sat Ajax, a magnificent black stallion whose muscles rippled like liquid steel under his glossy coat. The horse's ceremonial tack was as immaculate as his rider's uniform, brass fittings catching the morning light, leather straps oiled and buffed to perfection. To everyone watching, they looked exactly like every postcard about British pageantry, picture perfect tradition in living form. What the tourists didn't know. Here's what those tourists snapping selfies didn't know about the man sitting so impossibly still above them. Hale had done 2 tours in Afghanistan with the household cavalry. He'd held a forward observation post in Helmand while mortar rounds landed close enough to shower him with debris, close enough that he could taste the cordite and feel the ground shake beneath his boots. There was shrapnel buried so deep in his left shoulder that surgeons said it was safer to leave it there. Sometimes, when the weather changed like this, he could feel it shifting under the muscle like a cold reminder of places he'd rather forget. He'd watched a 19-year-old trooper named Davies bleed out in his arms after an IED tore through their convoy, whispering promises about letters he'd write to a girlfriend back in Yorkshire who worked at a bakery and made the best scones Davies had ever tasted. Hale would later have to write those letters himself, finding words for grief that no training manual had ever prepared him for. He'd learned to sleep through rocket attacks and stay alert through 48-hour watches where a moment's inattention meant the difference between coming home alive and coming home in a box with a folded flag. If you knew what to look for, you could see the signs, the controlled breathing that comes from years of staying calm when everything around you is going to hell. The way his eyes, though fixed on that ceremonial point in the distance, never quite stopped scanning the periphery, old habits from places where survival depended on noticing the things that didn't belong. But he didn't talk about any of that. No war stories posted on social media, no wearing his service record like a badge, no dropping hints in conversation about what he'd seen in places most people couldn't find on a map. To the crowd, he was just part of the show, a tradition wrapped in red wool and ceremony, as unchanging as the stone lions guarding the palace steps. That was about to change dramatically. The arrival of Agent Webbeckhouse 50 meters away, a sleek black sedan with American diplomatic plates, had just pulled up wrong to flashy, blocking the ceremonial approach. No escort vehicles, no official convoy, no entry logged through proper channels. Out stepped Agent Marcus Webb. If you'd seen him on any American street, you'd have pegged him for exactly what he was: federal law enforcement with an attitude problem. Mid-30s, built like a college linebacker who traded his gym routine for too many hours at a desk. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, his tie knotted with military precision, his shoes polished federal black, and his sunglasses reflecting nothing but authority and impatience. Webb had been stationed at the U.S. Embassy for 3 weeks, supposedly part of some joint security assessment nobody had clear details about. But his swagger said he wasn't here to fill out reports and attend briefings. He moved like a man, accustomed to getting his way through credentials and intimidation, the kind of federal agent who saw every interaction as a test of his authority. That morning, he'd been wound up about a security briefing that hadn't gone his way, something about enhanced protocols and diplomatic sensitivities that his supervisor kept throwing around like they truly meant something. Webb had spent 15 years kicking down doors in Detroit and Minneapolis, places where problems got solved with direct action rather than diplomatic niceties. All this British ceremony struck him as elaborate theater designed to waste time. He'd been watching Hale for 10 minutes, and something about that perfect stillness was getting under his skin. Maybe it was the way tourists whispered reverently as they took pictures, like they were in a cathedral instead of on a public street. Maybe it was the way other officials seemed to give the guards respectful distance, treating them like they were somehow untouchable. Or maybe it was just that Hale's silence felt like judgment, and Webb had never been comfortable with being judged by anyone, especially someone he saw as basically a museum exhibit in fancy dress. The confrontation walked right up to Hale and stopped close enough that any normal person would have acknowledged him. "Agent Webb, Federal Bureau of Investigation," he announced, flashing his badge. "I need you to shift position. We've got a security assessment running, and you're blocking a critical sight line." Hale kept staring at that fixed point in the distance and moved as stone. Webb frowned. "You hear me, soldier?" "Nothing." Still nothing. Behind the barrier, a Scottish woman's voice carried over. "He's not allowed to move, is he, dear?" "That's the whole point," came the response. "They're famous for it, like statues." "They are." Webb's jaw tightened. Being corrected by civilians was exactly what pushed his buttons. "Look, I'm not asking you to break into song and dance," Webb said, stepping closer. "Just step aside for 5 minutes so we can sort this security issue out." Hale remained perfectly still. If anything, his posture got straighter, demonstrating exactly what immovable looked like. "What's the matter?" Webb's voice was getting louder now. "Batteries died in your costume." A few uncomfortable chuckles from the crowd. But the mood was shifting. This wasn't the good-natured banter tourists expected. Webb stepped even closer now, well inside Hale's personal space. "You know what I think? I think you people just stand here playing dress up because you couldn't cut it in a real uniform." Still nothing from Hale, but his left hand resting on his saber hilt tensed slightly before relaxing, a micro-movement that spoke of tremendous self-control. A father holding his daughter's hand spoke up from the crowd. "Officer, he's just doing his job." Webb turned, face flushed. "And I'm doing mine, sir. So unless you want to explain to your daughter why Daddy got arrested for interfering with federal business, keep your opinions to yourself." The man stepped back, pulling his daughter closer. But the little girl kept staring at Hale with wide eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is the American man being mean to the soldier?" Her father didn't have a good answer for that. Webb turned back, something personal now in his expression, like this had stopped being about security and started being about winning a contest only he was playing. "You really think you're something special, don't you? Standing there like a statue while real law enforcement does actual work." He jabbed a finger toward Hale's chest, not quite making contact but threatening enough. "I bet you wouldn't last 10 minutes on a real beat dealing with actual criminals instead of posing for tourist photos." A teenage girl was recording now, sensing something significant happening. "You know what? I don't think you can even hear me," Webb said, voice rising. "I think you're so far up your own ass with this ceremonial nonsense that you've forgotten you're supposed to be a human being." The crowd had gone completely quiet. Phones were recording, but no one was laughing anymore. Webb took one more step forward, almost touching Hale's ceremonial breastplate. "I've dealt with terrorists who are more responsive than you. At least they had the courtesy to shoot back. Ajax snorted, ears flicking back. Animals always know when violence is coming. Webb noticed and smiled unpleasantly. Are you going to defend your boyfriend? Is that what passes for backup around here? That's when his hand moved to his jacket. It started casual, maybe adjusting his suit, maybe reaching for his phone, but the movement was too practiced, too familiar. His fingers found his jacket edge and lifted it slightly, revealing the shoulder holster underneath. The crowd tensed like a held breath. A woman gasped. Someone's child started crying, but Hale didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't even blink. Webb's hand moved decisively, now sliding inside his jacket. His fingers found his service Glock. 15 years of federal service in practiced motion. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Gasps turned to screams. People ducked behind benches, pulled children close, scrambled for cover. An elderly woman dropped her purse, coins scattering across cobblestones. But Webb didn't draw completely. He held it low, angled downward but visible, a threat without being an outright attack. The kind of intimidation he'd used dozens of times where badges weren't enough. Final warning, he said, voice steady and professional. Step aside. I need access to that building, and you're going to get out of my way. Ajax snorted hard, powerful frame trembling with contained energy. The horse could smell the metal, sense the danger. But he remained in position, trained discipline overriding every instinct. And Hale didn't move a muscle, not even when a loaded firearm was 6 feet from his chest, not even when tourists were screaming behind him. Not even when every survival instinct was screaming at him to respond. He just sat there, perfect. And still, like the threat didn't exist. Like Webb didn't exist. Drop the weapon. Someone shouted from the crowd, but it wasn't police or security. Just a bystander with more courage than sense. He's got a gun. A woman's voice rang out, sharp and clear and terrified. More screams, now real panic. But still no running, because even in their fear, the tourists understood they were witnessing something significant, something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. Webb looked around at the chaos he'd created, at the phones recording his every move, at the faces staring at him with a mixture of horror and fascination. For a moment, just a moment, doubt flickered across his features, but then he looked back at Hale, still sitting motionless on his horse, and the doubt hardened into something colder. All this, he muttered, loud enough for the nearest tourists to hear. For a man playing statue, he shifted his stance, planting his feet wider, raising the pistol slightly higher, not aimed, not yet, but ready, threatening. A weapon in the hands of someone who clearly thought he was the only one in this square with any real power. Ajax took one deliberate step forward, not panicked, not startled. Measured, controlled. The kind of movement that speaks of training so deep it becomes instinct. Hale's grip on the reins tightened just a fraction, the only sign that he was even aware of what was happening around him. But that tiny movement sent a signal that rippled out from the ceremonial square like a stone dropped in still water. Because hidden throughout the palace complex in places tourists never see and most staff never go, alarms were beginning to sound, not the kind you hear in movies, no wailing sirens or flashing red lights, just quiet, urgent tones that mean one thing: a guard is in immediate danger. And when a guard is in immediate danger, the entire weight of British military tradition responds. The response Webb never saw them coming. The first sign was a low rumble that seemed to come from the stones themselves. Then came the synchronized sound of vehicle doors slamming, followed by measured bootsteps on cobblestones, multiple pairs, many pairs, moving with precision that only comes from years of training for exactly this scenario. The vehicles appeared from different directions as if they'd been waiting in shadows. Matte black Range Rovers with discreet markings that military people would recognize meant serious business. They moved without sirens, without flashes, just quiet. Professional efficiency, more intimidating than any noise could be. The lead vehicle stopped precisely 20 meters away. The second blocked the road to the American embassy. The third cut off any escape route. Then the doors opened. Out stepped the armed palace response unit, black tactical gear, weapons held with casual competence. Faces revealing nothing. They moved like water flowing downhill, inevitable, unstoppable, natural. What made them truly intimidating wasn't their equipment or training. It was their silence. No shouted commands. No aggressive posturing. They simply took positions around the ceremonial square with the quiet confidence of people who'd done this many times before. Webb turned in a slow circle, finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd stumbled into. "Drop your weapon," came the command, not shouted, just spoken clearly across the square. "Place your hands above your head." The voice belonged to Captain Hannah Ree, stepping out from behind the lead vehicle with the kind of presence that makes everyone instinctively stand straighter. Mid-40s, steel gray eyes, wearing an immaculate Royal Military Police uniform with green and gold insignia marking her as someone with real authority. Webb looked around wildly, weapon still raised but trembling. "I'm a federal agent. I have diplomatic immunity. You can't." "You drew a firearm on a serving member of the British Army while he was performing ceremonial duties on Crown property," Captain Ree interrupted, voice perfectly level. "That makes this our jurisdiction." She took a step closer, hands clasped behind her back, completely unconcerned about the weapon in Webb's hands. "Sir, you have exactly 10 seconds to place that weapon on the ground and surrender yourself to our custody. If you fail to comply, my team has authorization to use whatever force is necessary." Webb's eyes darted around, looking for escape routes that didn't exist, backup that wasn't coming, some way out of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his control. Everywhere he looked, professional soldiers had positioned themselves with surgical precision, cutting off every possible avenue of retreat. "This is insane," Webb muttered, but his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "I barely threatened him. Look at him, he's fine." Captain Ree glanced at Hale, still motionless atop Ajax, staring at that invisible point in the distance, completely unchanged by the drama around him. "Yes," she said quietly. "He is fine because he's been trained to remain fine under circumstances far more challenging than an agitated American with a handgun." She paused. "The question now is whether you're intelligent enough to recognize that you've lost this confrontation before it becomes something that ends your career and possibly your freedom." Webb's hand was shaking now, the weight of the pistol suddenly feeling enormous. Around him, tourists watched in complete silence, their phones recording every moment of what was clearly going to be either a surrender or something much worse. The child's voice cut through the tension, the same little girl who'd asked earlier why the American was being mean to the soldier. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging on her mother's coat, "is the bad man going to go to jail now?" Her mother looked down at her daughter, then back at the standoff in the ceremonial square, and spoke just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Yes, sweetheart," she said firmly. "He is." Somehow, those simple words from a concerned mother carried more weight than all of Webb's credentials and authority combined, because everyone present, tourists and soldiers, adults and children, British citizens and foreign visitors, understood that they were witnessing justice in action. Not the kind that comes from courtrooms and lawyers, the immediate, undeniable kind that happens when someone crosses a line that should never be crossed. Webb looked at the faces surrounding him, saw the mixture of contempt and pity in their expressions, and finally understood that there was no way out of this that didn't end with him in custody. His hand opened. The pistol fell to the cobblestones with a sharp clatter that seemed to echo forever in the sudden silence. He raised his hands above his head, shoulders sagging with defeat and the weight of consequences he was just beginning to understand. "I surrender," he said quietly. The aftermath. Two members of the Armed Palace Response Unit moved forward immediately, their movements smooth and practiced. They secured Webb's hands behind his back with zip ties, collected his weapon and badge, and conducted a rapid but thorough search for additional weapons or devices. Through it all, Webb kept looking back at Hale as if he still couldn't quite believe that a man could remain so completely unmoved by armed confrontation. "He never even flinched," he said to one of the officers securing him, his voice filled with something that might have been admiration if it hadn't been tinged with so much bitterness. "I had a gun pointed at him, and he didn't even blink." The officer glanced toward the ceremonial guard, then back at Webb with an expression that suggested he was looking at someone who'd fundamentally missed the point of everything that had just happened. "Ed, that's not a bug," the officer said quietly as he guided Webb toward one of the waiting vehicles. "That's a feature." As they walked past Captain Ree, she fell into step beside them, her pace measured and unhurried. "Agent Webb." She said, her voice carrying that particular tone military officers use when they want to ensure their words are remembered. "You came here today thinking that authority came from your badge and your weapon. You thought that uniform made him weak and yours made you strong." He gestured toward Hale, still sitting motionless on his horse. "But real authority, the kind that matters, doesn't come from what you carry. It comes from what you can endure. And today, you learn the difference between having power and being powerful." Webb couldn't respond because deep down, underneath all his frustration and embarrassment and wounded pride, he knew she was right. They loaded him into the back of the lead vehicle, and as the convoy prepared to depart, something remarkable happened. The tourists began to applaud. The lesson: so here's the question that matters. When someone tries to break you down in public, tries to make you react, tries to drag you down to their level, what's the stronger choice? Fighting back or refusing to be moved? In our world of instant reactions and social media explosions, is there still power in choosing silence over spectacle? In trusting that the right response might be no response at all? Let us know what you think in the comments below. These conversations matter more than you realize, and we read every single response. If this story showed you something about real strength, about what it means to stand your ground without throwing a punch, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps more than you know. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our daily stories about the remarkable men and women who guard these ancient traditions. And if you know someone who needs to see what true authority looks like, someone who thinks power means making the most noise until people pay attention, share this video with them. Your next Royal Guard story is waiting right there on your screen. Click it. And we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real strength doesn't announce itself. It simply stands. And when it does, even the loudest voices in the world discover they have nothing left to say.